the logic of, well, this is a rich person, so they don't need it. There's some really poor people right now who really need more cash. That is a very strong logic. We've been walking down that path for decades, and it's relatively hard to see how you could reverse course.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And before we start today's episode, I have some exciting news, which is that on the 4th of November, we're going to be recording a live episode of the podcast at the British Library in London. We're going to look at the Chancellor's options for raising more tax in the budget. We'll be joined by our very own Stuart Adam and by Dan Needle, who is founder of Tax Policy Associates. And we'll look at all of the options, everything from taxing wealth to whether Labour should break one of their manifesto pledges. And you'll have a chance to ask us your own questions too. Tickets are free, but spaces are limited, so sign up now via the link in the description. We look forward to seeing you there. But today, we are discussing the design of the welfare system and specifically exploring one of the central questions in social security: who should get benefits? We'll no doubt talk about the benefits that have been in the news recently, including winter fuel payment, benefits for children, benefits for disabilities. And we'll cover the big ones: universal credit, pensions. We'll even talk about universal basic income. But the aim today is not to get into the nitty-gritty of those specific benefits. Instead, we're going to look at the big design questions. When should benefits be universal, meaning that everyone in a group gets them? When should they be contributory, meaning that you have to put something in before you get something out? And when should they be means tested, meaning they go to those on low incomes but are withdrawn as incomes rise? We'll trace the story of Britain's social security system from its conception in the 1940s as a something for something system to the system we have today, in which contributory benefits are few and far between and means testing has become ever more prevalent. And to explore this area, I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Waters, who's an Associate Director here at the IFS, and by Nicholas Timmins, who is a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government and at the King's Fund, and importantly, is the author of a wonderful book called The Five Giants, a biography of the welfare state, and is therefore perfectly placed to help us with the history. Welcome to you both.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Let's start at the beginning. So I think I'm right in saying that before the Second World War, Britain had some health and unemployment schemes, but it really was the report written by William Beveridge and published in 1943 that founds Britain's modern welfare state. And he explicitly wanted benefits that came as a right and without means testing. So Nick, you've written tons about this. What was Beveridge's big vision?
Right. Well, Beveridge hated means tests. He had a visceral dislike of means tests. And he wasn't alone in that, because the 1930s means test was a household means test. And if any money came in, your benefit could be reduced. So even the child getting a paper round could lead to benefit being reduced, or a parent suddenly a grandparent acquiring a pension. And because it was so mean, it generated a lot of snitching. You know, if a new coat appeared or a new pair of shoes and it wasn't even explainable, you had the benefit man around. And Beveridge disapproved on other grounds too. He felt that it discouraged thrift. He was very much in favour of thrift, saving money for a rainy day. There's not much point in saving money for a rainy day if it's going to be any money you save is going to reduce your benefit level. So his sort of kind of overall view was that the means tested benefits they were offered only on terms which make men unwilling to have recourse to them. So he went for a national insurance system. So that was something for something. I mean, Beveridge was a very arrogant man. He knew what the British people wanted. And he said, what the British people want is a something for something system. So you pay in your contributions in the good times and you get your benefits as of right in bad times. So he built this national insurance system for unemployment insurance and industrial injuries and what have you, on the principle that no means test can be applied to any part of it. And that, broadly speaking, is what got enacted by the Labour government in 1946.
So they had the something for something system, but I think it was recognised pretty early on that there were some people, therefore, who hadn't got the contributions, they hadn't put something in, they wouldn't otherwise have got something out, but we might still wanted to give them something. So even with that kind of clear conception of a national insurance system, I think I'm right in saying right from the very start there was something else.
There was something called national assistance, which is basically what became income support, which is in a sense the means tested bit of universal credit is its successor many decades down the line. So there was a sort of safety net of means tested benefit, but it was in fact very small. at the time because the war had produced full employment. Wars tend to produce full employment because everyone's making munitions or in the army or whatever on the Air Force. And so it was very, very small initially, and it was mainly top-ups for pensioners. And that kind of held through into the sort of 50s, beginning of the 60s, and then it all began to go a bit wrong.
Let's unpack that, Tom. I mean, we're going to dig into more of the details, but just paint the kind of broad arc for us. So Beveridge sets out this national insurance system where you put something in, you get something out. But if you look at the system today, that's not how the system today broadly works. So how do we get here?
So maybe a couple of numbers would help kind of set the picture. So if you look back in the late 70s at all working age benefit spending, less than a quarter of it, about 23%, was means tested. If you zoom forward to today, it's 63%. So significant majority is means tested. So we're really seeing very big change. If you look at contributory benefits, the something for something benefits, back in the late 70s, it was 38% of contributory. Now it's just 8%. It's a really small proportion of the system. And so I think there's been quite a few things that have contributed to that change. There's been some kind of broader demographic, social, economic changes. So a rise of lone parenthood has pushed towards means testing. We've had, if you look over the broad sweep of history, you have, periods where there's higher unemployment following a recession. That tends to push up the number of people on means testing over that period. But then also policy changes, some really important policy changes. So a couple perhaps to pull out. One of them is the introduction of housing benefit. And so if you're on low income, you get support with your rent, and that the introduction of the national system of housing benefit, at least, that led to a big increase in the number of people getting means tested benefits. And you can kind of see why that's means tested. It's something that is reflecting the fact that you have a low income and you've got high rent right now. It's kind of an ongoing, it's an ongoing problem. It's not just like a short period out of work. And then another factor is the sort of slow but steady increase in the amount of support for people who are on low income in work. So through things like tax credits, before that family credit, before that family income support. That's been expanded steadily over time and has meant, again, more and more means testing because we're targeting it towards those who are on a low income but are in work. But I don't know if Nick thinks I've missed anything important there.
Well, do you think it was always inevitable that we would move up towards means testing? Because in some ways, when you've got a smaller benefit system, a welfare system, social security system, however you want to frame it, the kind of you put something in, you get something out, works for some things. But as we said earlier, there are always some people who haven't put enough in, and the people you want to support, whether, as Tom said, that's lone parents, people with high housing costs, people with disabilities. But the minute you want to support them, supporting all of them in the country is hugely expensive. And then lo and behold, you're back to a system where you support them, but only those on low incomes, and you're into means testing. So was it always inevitable that we would effectively get to a system of means testing, do you think?
I'm not sure it was inevitable, but there were quite strong forces, some of which you've outlined, driving in that direction. And this is something you might come on to later. It's partly the way Beveridge designed the system, because it's a flat rate system. So you pay a flat rate of national insurance contributions and you get a flat rate benefit out. Whereas most European countries, for example, went for earnings-related benefit system. So the better off pay more money in, but when they fall out of work, they get a higher rate of benefit because they contributed more. So the effect in the UK is even if you're better off and you lose your job, you fall down to this platform of the minimal benefit. You come straight down. Whereas in France, Germany, your position in society is protected for a bit longer by the earnings-related element. And I think one effect of that was that the middle classes had less of a stake in the benefit system than they did in health and education. So for education, they didn't have to pay school fees anymore. They'd got their healthcare free. They weren't having to pay for it or take out insurance. So there was huge gains to the middle class. There was less of a gain in the benefit system to them. So there was probably less middle class support for the social security system than other parts of the welfare state.
So I think just to say that back to you, I think what you're basically saying is, had we have gone for more of an earnings-related system, where you put something in, you got something out, but actually what you got out was linked to how much you'd put in, maybe the middle classes would have been more into that system, would have kept that for longer. We didn't have that. And therefore, what you saw is just an erosion of that system. And instead, the system tilting towards basically supporting people on lower incomes and then means testing it away.
And I mean, as Tom was saying, there are quite important structural reasons for this. So, for example, you talk about housing benefit, which has become a desperate case of running up and down escalator because it just keeps going up, and whatever they do to try and control it, it doesn't. But up until the sort of 70s, up until the 80s, government subsidised council house building and indeed social housing build more generally. So you could build and have low rents because the building was subsidised. And when you move to subsidising the rent rather than the building, you end up with a means-tested system because people can't afford it. When the rents go up, they can't afford it. They need help with the rent. And so that's a big, one of the big drivers of the increase in means testing.
So maybe we should look at some specific examples. Obviously, it's easy to talk about these things in the concrete. And I think it's we should distinguish between benefits for the working age population, for pensioners, and for those benefits that are targeted at children, disability and other things. Maybe we'll just start with unemployment insurance, which is maybe kind of where a lot of these social security systems start. I think some people at least, will be surprised to hear what you said earlier, Nick, about there are countries in which when you lose your job, the government replaces a very large share of your previous earnings. And that feels really alien to us here in the UK because it's just not how we do things. But Tom, there are pros and cons to these different choices, right? There's not one obvious, you should definitely do it this way, and that's the way that everyone thinks is better.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd say as well, it's not just that there are some countries do this. Like really, it's the UK that's pretty much the exception. I think there's a few other countries, but if you look across the OECD, so relatively well-off countries, it's definitely the norm to have some kind of higher level of support when you first lose your job. So yeah, I'd say there's a couple of arguments you could give in both directions. As I say, so starting with means testing, I think the real attraction of means testing, and perhaps one reason why it's grown, is you're getting support to the poorest people right now. Kind of by definition, you're only giving support to people who pass the means test, who are on a low income. And so if you want to deal with poverty, you think back to the Labour government in 1997, they had these poverty targets to get poverty down. How do you get money towards people who are in poverty? The most straightforward way to do it by a long way is to means test. And so I think that's a clear point, in favour of means testing. I'd say as well, this kind of relates to some of the things we've already been talking about. I think contributory benefits work better if there are periods where your income is unusually low. So you're unemployed, you're sick for a while, even you're retired. And I think where it's harder to see how the contributory kind of principle could work if it's to support people who are just on a low wage, and that's the wage they're going to be on for their life. Because kind of when could they pay in to get the money out, if you like? And so a lot of, as we've been saying, a lot of the rise in means testing is for in-work support, people who are on low income, they're in work. And I think that kind of has to be means tested support. It's harder to see how you could do it the other way. So that's two arguments in favor of means testing. Contributory benefits, I think there's a few things one could say. I think one actually perhaps underrated point is one thing we worry about with having taxes when you're in work, means test benefits when you're out of work is the work incentive effects, right? And both on the tax side and on the benefit side, you're kind of blunting work incentives. If you have contributory benefits, that goes some way to offsetting that, because you get into work, now you lose some of your salary, some of your earnings by having to make a contribution, towards your national insurance contribution or whatever, but you're kind of gaining a right. You're gaining a right to have higher income when you lose your job or when you're sick or when you're retired or whatever. And so there's a way in which that actually helps offset some of those disincentives to work. And perhaps another reason, say, in favor of contributory benefits is kind of along the lines of what Nick was saying earlier, is it might enhance the political acceptability of it. There's a something for something principle, and perhaps that makes the system more sustainable.
So what do you think, Nick? I mean, sticking with the unemployment insurance issue for now, and we'll talk about pensioners and children in a minute. Yeah. I mean, we have a bit of a contribution system, but not much. Not much.
Well, no, there is still a contributory-based job seekers allowance and contributory-based employment support allowance. So the government's proposing to change both those. So it is. I mean, Tom's right about you can't use contributory benefits to deal with low wages. I mean, one of the other big reasons why means testing has risen so much is the increase in in-work poverty, so to speak, which started off with a tiny little scheme called family income supplement. They realised you could be in work, but you would be better off on benefit in the 70s. And that became family credit, which got increasingly more generous. But there was this moment in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when both Labour and the Conservatives realised that unemployment benefit and the like is normally given on condition you are not working, if you see what I mean. And they suddenly realised that the globalization has squeezed wages down the lower and middle end. So it's better to use some of the benefit money to support people in low-paid work rather than to just give them money on condition they did not work. So that's where you see the big rise with tax credits coming in and now universal credit. And people tend to forget that I think it's something like 40% of the people on universal credit are actually in work. You know, people tend to view it as a benefit for those out of work, and an awful lot of people are on universal credit and are in work. And that contributes to the rise in means testing because you're paying benefits to people who are actually working, means tested benefits to people who are actually working.
But do you think we should keep the I mean, so the one approach would be to say we've been whittling away these contribution-based benefits. Let's just put the nail in the coffin and get rid of them. But for all the changes we have clung on to, like you said, the bits that are the bits of unemployment insurance that are effectively related to what you've earned in the past. I think you would cling on to them. Is that right?
I think that's a good case for actually hanging on to what little is left. I mean, there's certainly some people in the Department for Work and Pensions would love to get rid of them because it's much tidier. We could just get rid of these two little bits that are left around and have to run separate systems for them. But, you know, if you get contribution-related job seekers allowance, there are definite advantages to it. Universal credit is a household means test, so the income of the entire household is taken into account. Contributory JSA is an individual benefit. So if you lose your job, but your partner is earning and has savings, there's no savings rule in contributory-based JSA, whereas there is in universal credit. So in universal credit, you've got a lot of savings. You don't get it until you run your savings down. If you get the contributory-based JSA, there's no savings test. So it's a bigger, it is a bit more like the European system. It's more of a cushion against unemployment. And people may say, well, does that remove the incentive to get a job? Well, I think all the evidence is that people who've paid enough contributions in and get made unemployed actually are highly motivated to get another job. And so so it's worth cushioning them, A, so they might find the right job rather than just a lower paid job to get them into work. And B, they may well also cut their expenditure down by less because they have this cushion than they would otherwise, and that kind of helps the economy turn over very, very marginally, but it's a slight argument in favour. So I think there's definitely a case for keeping them, keeping what is there.
And of course, I framed it as a question of should we keep them or get rid of them. We could increase them, right? I mean, and the government is thinking about what to do with unemployment insurance. And
well, I mean, the moment what the government is proposing is to make JSA more generous, but at the price of reducing the length of time for which this gets very complicated, for which those in the support group of employment support allowance, who at the moment are not required to look for work, reducing, and you can be on that sort of permanently subject to an occasional retest.
These are people who are disabled.
Yeah, exactly. And they're proposing to cut that down to 12 months. So, you know, they're offering to make the unemployment bit more generous, but at the expense of people with disabilities who will have this support group limited to a year before they are required to do something in the terms of preparing for work or looking for work. Yeah.
And we've talked elsewhere about the kind of shift that the government's planning away from maybe people with disability and towards other people without work. Maybe we'll do a deep dive into that another day. But for now, just to avoid the nitty-gritty, let's talk about pensions. Because obviously it's been a big change in how we do pensions too. And I think there's tons of myths about pensions. I think one of the biggest myths is that people think they pay in their national insurance contributions over their working life and it goes into some kind of pot. And at the end, they're drawing down that pot. And that's not at all how it works. So for us, it's a pay-as-you-earn system. You're not paying into any kind of pot. And it's not even really a strong contribution-based system in the sense that you have to have your 35 years of contributions to get your state pension. But there are lots of ways to get those contributions that don't actually entail paying tax, like looking after children. So really now the link between contributions and what you get out of a pension is vanishingly small. It's nothing like the European-style system of you put in lots and you get out. So actually, pensions are looking a bit more universal, maybe contingent. Everyone in the kind of old age pensioner group gets that benefit. So we've moved away from the something for something, but not towards means testing so much as towards this kind of more contingent benefit.
We've kind of, without keeping it in practice, as you've spelt it out, we've kind of kept the concept of something for pensions, you know, and they are getting a bit closer to being a universal basic income because, you know, it will be possible in future not to qualify for a full basic state pension, but it's going to be quite difficult because you can get credited in for all sorts of things and you only have to work for a bit. So, you know, so it sort of has survived. Mind you, it's been on a roller coaster journey. I mean, there was a point when it was being, because it was being linked only to inflation for donkey's years, it was just disappearing, slowly but surely disappearing. And it was only the Pensions Commission in the 2000s that kind of rescued it.
And now, of course, it's on the other direction. We have the triple lock, and now that's
yes,
it's not disappearing now. It's ratcheting up.
It is ratcheting up, and at some point that will have to come to an end. But have to find the government that's prepared to do it.
I think there's sort of broad support that we have this basic state pension. Basically, it's pretty hard to live in the UK for your entire life or most of your adult life and not get this thing. So it's more like a universal contingent benefit. The other benefit that's been in the news recently is winter fuel payment, which was a universal benefit for old people. But got the government into trouble, Tom.
Indeed. So, yes, it used to go, so it's £200 or £300, and it used to go to essentially all pensioners. And the government last summer, is that correct? Summer 24, yes, they tied it to, you have to get pension credit, which is a means-tested benefit. So it is essentially means testing winter fuel payment. You have to get pension credit to get winter fuel payment, which meant that 90% of pensioners wouldn't get it. And then this summer, this few months ago, they've sort of reversed course most of the way. I think we're now back to something like 75% of pensioners getting it. So it was 100, then 10%, then 75%. And I think the kind of the rationale of the original policy to try to get rid of means testing it was to say, if you're on a higher income, you don't need this extra bit of support. But of course, it's something that people have, quite sort of in one sense, quite a strong attachment to. It's worth saying, whilst we're here, it has nothing to do with fuel. It is just cash. You don't have to spend it on fuel. It does come in the winter, so in that sense, the name is correct. But I think it's part of that sense of, well, this was something that people had felt like they've been getting. Often they would have been getting it for years or even decades, and have it taken away. That caused a lot of difficulty.
It's a classic example of one of the other reasons why contributory benefits have shrunk somewhat is because the argument is better off people don't need it. That's always been the argument against contributory benefits. And of course, when Gordon Brown first introduced this thing, it was more generous for people on pension credit and the lower income, and a smaller sum for everybody else. This is progressive universalism. We'll give something to everybody, but more to the less well off. And so we end up where we end up. You could argue, there is something slightly paternalistic about it, isn't there? You're actually saying pensioners can't cope with budgeting over the winter, even though winter comes every year. So we have to give them a special lump of money in Christmas time to get them through the winter. It's a slightly strange approach to benefits, I think. It's like, should we give them a laundry voucher just to make sure they do the laundry?
It's also odd that we have the state pension. Again, it's a flat rate for most people. Then this other little benefit that's kind of wedged on top, as opposed to just deciding what you want the state pension to be and setting that, and not having this weird little thing on the top. I think most people would buy the argument that you have lots of people who aren't in fuel poverty or any other kind of poverty and don't need this payment. I think part of the reason that didn't go through for the government is kind of the politics of it. They announced it in the summer in what felt like out of context, what felt like picking on pensioners. I think arguably had they done that in a more sensible way as part of a bigger budget process, maybe they'd have got away with their original plans. Because I think a lot of people understand that it is odd to be giving winter fuel payments to people who are very well off.
Well, in a way, but as you say, it's also just sort of, it could just be part of the state pension. We give the state pension to people who are perfectly well off. So in that sense, I'm not so sure it is odd.
The fact that it's billed as different to the state pension, right? I think if you rolled it in, I think in fact it's an extra payment that is labelled, and it is just labelled. You're absolutely right. It's just labelling. You don't actually have to spend it on. You could spend it on cigarettes or whatever. But the fact that it's labelled as we're helping with your fuel, then I think it seems odd to some people at least to hear, well, the government. Why is the government helping people, in this kind of situation? Okay, let's talk about children, because I think there's some interesting stuff there. We have, this is, again, lots of changes happened here. We had for a long time a child benefit that was a payment that went to families for all of their children. And then earlier you mentioned, Tom, Tony Blair trying to tackle poverty. I think I'm right in saying at that point he added it in a means-tested benefit for the reasons you said, in order to target support at those on the lower income. So we had that means testing, and now child benefit itself has been means tested, and now the child of universal credit has been capped. So we started off with this concept of, I guess, children add cost will have a benefit, but over time we've been moving towards more means. So maybe, Tom, talk us through like the effects of that and what it means.
So I think there's a kind of a rationale saying, look, if you have two families who have the same income, but one of them's got several children, the other one doesn't have any children, overall, taking into account all tax and benefits, do we want the system to be treating the two of those families exactly the same? I think there's a rationale for saying, well, no, the one with kids have got higher costs, and so we want them to pay on net, to pay less tax. And so that it strikes me that that's a sort of a coherent justification for having a universal child benefit, which, as you say, we had for a long time. I mean, I think in its current form, child benefit started in the late 1970s, and all the way until 2013, it was universal. And then I think this connects to what we were just saying a minute ago, this sort of feeling of, well, rich people don't need it, and so we can means test it. And we have this quite strange means test based on...
That's very generous. It's a very strange means test.
It's unbelievably clunky.
It's very... Yeah, exactly. So the higher earning partner is the only one that matters of the parents, and
for this particular test.
For this particular test, they're not for literally any other. If your income is over £80,000, you don't get any child benefit at all. Whereas for universal credit or for child tax credit before it, it's a household means test. So we're trying to target resources towards those households that are on a low income. So we're in this sort of slightly strange middle position between full universality and sort of proper means testing. We have this kind of slightly weird means test.
It seems to me for a long time there was a clear story, like you were saying, a clear story about child benefit. And I think you can see, of all the cases where you might argue for a universal benefit, well, I keep saying universal, I think really I mean contingent on being in a state, so on having a child. So it's not literally everybody in the country, it's once you have a child. Because you can make a clear case for there's an extra cost associated with having a child, and maybe the government wants to support that. I think disability has some of that flavour too, and we'll come back to that. Yeah, now we have this funny hodgepodge where for lots of people, it is kind of universal. You get these benefits, but there's also big means testing. I mean, Nick, do you think we're just confused about what we're trying to do with child benefit?
I suppose we are a bit confused. Yes, I mean, there's the argument you put. There's also kind of argument, that society as a whole has a stake in its children, and therefore is interested in looking after all children because it's the interest of society as a whole. That's not popular. It's not an argument you hear spelled out very often these days, but it was certainly one of the arguments behind child benefit when child benefit came in. And I think there's validity in that. And the fact that some people may be sufficiently well off to spend it on a better bottle of wine, well, kind of that's a price you pay maybe for ensuring there's no stigma about receiving child benefit. And we haven't talked about stigma, but there is a stigma attached to receiving means-tested benefits, rightly or wrongly. People do perceive that. So I think it has a real advantage in being a universal, in that sense, benefit. And I think the same applies to the basic state pension. I mean, why do we not means test the basic state pension? We tax it, so the better off pay back a good chunk of what they get, certainly if they're higher rate taxpayers. But we do it because it gives you a platform of a minimum income on which you can then build your savings, knowing that you will see the benefit of having done the saving. Whereas if you means test the basic state pension, then you don't know whether you don't know whether any of yours, the initial bit of your savings actually be worth anything, because it might just get means tested away, so you don't actually see any benefit of having done it. So having that that's another reason why it's a good reason for there being a universal basic state pension.
Just back to the children, I mean, it's worth pointing out, isn't it, that sort of flavours of this debate are raging right now around the 2-child limit. So within universal credit, it used to be the case that you got an extra payment for each child. Now you only get an extra payment for the first 2 children and not for the 3rd child. So that's within a means-tested benefit, so that gets means-tested away. But now there's this contingent element where it depends on which child it is. And some people are talking now about the fact that removing that policy would reduce child poverty. It would be very well targeted in a means-tested kind of way towards low-income people. But the supporters of that policy say, well, actually, we need the incentives across families to line up. So those families who don't get means-tested benefit and have a child have to face the financial incentives, and those who have benefits should face that incentive. So in some ways, there is some trade-offs here, right, that you can't really get round. You're trying to think about who to target benefits to, how to preserve work incentives, how to treat different families in similar ways when actually they're often quite different. I mean, it's just kind of tricky, right, Tom?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there is a question the government should, does the government want to or to what extent, I should say, does the government want to subsidise or incentivise people having children? Isn't it saying that society has an interest in the raising of children and indeed the propagation of society? And so I think there's a legitimate question there. How much should the state be supporting in cash form or other form, be supporting having kids? I suppose it seems to me with a 2-child limit that part of that sort of rationale, as you say, is exactly what I said. Is we want the people who are on benefits to have faced the same financial constraints that those who aren't on benefits face when they're having a kid. But obviously, in one sense, we don't have that anyway. If you have your first or second child when you're on universal credit, you get an extra cash. If you get housing support, you often at least get extra cash for having more children. And if we were to go the whole hog and say we want to have the same incentives for rich and poor to have more kids, that would imply not having any means tested benefits for families with children, which would be a very, very, very severe change from where we are now. So it seemed a little bit odd to me. That.
I think it's a good point. A lot of these benefits are having multiple effects, right? They're often affecting things like work incentives, but also the incentives to save, to change jobs, about whether to have children in the first place, and all sorts of other things. So I think what makes this area complicated is that there are just lots of things going on.
Well, as you said, the whole of social security is riddled with trade-offs. They're all trade-offs, work incentives versus support versus universality, and everything's a trade-off.
Yeah. Let's do disability, because that's another big one that's been raging in the press, partly because there's been this huge increase in disabilities. Maybe, Tom, you fill us in on the background about why it's become more of an issue, and the fact that we actually have 2 types of benefits for disabled people now.
If you're working age, you can get an incapacity kind of benefit, which is mostly a higher element of universal credit. So that's means tested. If you're that's targeted those who are unable to work. If you have higher living costs broadly associated with your disability, then you can get another benefit, personal dependence payment, and that's not means tested at all. So that's kind of more in the spirit of some things we've been talking about, child benefit or the state pension. And it's certainly been in the news a lot because there's been this very significant increase in the number of people getting these benefits since the pandemic. So a kind of one way of thinking about it, before the pandemic, about 20,000 people began a claim for one of these benefits every month. And since about mid-2021, mid-2022, around then, that number's been about 40,000. So doubled the kind of the inflows into these benefits.
And that's huge, right? Let's underline that. That is a huge change in the number of people flowing onto these benefits.
It's a huge change because it's persisted. And when this first happened, we thought, maybe this is just kind of a post-COVID thing and it will just there'll be this little hump and it will go back down. But actually, it's still the case. It's just continued, still 40 or 50,000 a month starting claims. So it is a very important change. It means that over this decade as a whole, government spending on health-related benefits is set to grow by about £30 billion. So, really significant sum. It's worth saying that the rest of the working age benefit system, if anything, has been shrinking over time. So when you look at the thing as a whole, all spending on working age benefits is not the case that we're at a historically high level. But this part of it certainly has been has experienced quite a shocking rise.
And Nick, thinking back to the kind of Beveridge stuff, do you think disability is one of those things that just wasn't really? It wasn't really in the initial conception of the welfare state, at least to the degree to which it is now.
That is true. I mean, there was an industrial injuries scheme and there was a war disability scheme, and that was it at the beginning. So what changed over time was, well, one was medical advance, which meant that actually some people were kept alive with disability who would otherwise have died in the early days. So then you start saying, so what do we do for them? And slowly but surely growing awareness in society of the costs of disability. So if you get multiple sclerosis or some other debilitating disease, it's not your fault. It's not insurable. Society increasingly took the view we should do something to support these people. So you do get a big growth over the 70s and 80s of disability benefits of one form or another. Since when it's been, from the 2000s on, it's been a bit of a battle to try and contain the bill.
I think you can see the trade-offs we've been talking about today playing out in the debate, right? So the government, had some measures which have now been reversed, but you have these 2 benefits that you set out, Tom. One, it's basically a payment to all people deemed to have a disability, so a contingent benefit, if you like. Another part of the system, which is means tested. of course, if you move away from a means best tested system only goes to those on low incomes, but there are some people on higher incomes with disability. But if you support everyone with a disability, then you have to decide who it goes to. If you're not using income, you use some other criteria. So you use the how disabled are you, or what kind of disability you have, and that's kind of where the debate is going to play out in the next few years, right? It's really all about who's going to get benefits and for what reason.
Yeah, well, I think we'll have to see how it does play out, because it is, obviously it's no secret that the government struggled to pass much reform in this area, and so we'll have to see what they do with it. But one thing that was in the waters was being considered before the bill came out was, well, we could means test personal independence payments, and that ended up not making it into the bill. I don't have any inside knowledge. I don't know how seriously that was being taken. But you could imagine a world where the government says, well, we want to make a saving from this bill. What's the kind of easiest way to do it that's going to potentially, cause the least difficulty? Well, if we means test it, we'll say, you can be millionaires can get personal independence payment at the moment. We'll take that away. And you could imagine that kind of argument going through. But it comes back to exactly the kind of things we've been talking about. People can kind of say, well, rich people don't need it.
One of the other things that would help, correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't really understand why there has been this big increase in claims. And, if one could work out why this is happening and then do something about why it is happening, that might be a better way to constrain the bill than saying, how do we take money away from people? Yeah,
that would certainly be preferable to get the underlying demand down.
Especially so we do know, Tom, that some of the conditions that are rising are sort of mental health conditions, for example. So they're not all, some of the physical conditions you might think people have that are just stationary across life. Once you've got a chronic disease of some sort, it's a fixed characteristic now of that person. Whereas with other things, are maybe more likely that other interventions, talking therapies for people with mental health, for example, could help those people too. So there are other policy options in this sphere. There's one more thing I want to talk about before we sort of try and draw some lessons from all of this, which is universal basic income. We don't have a universal basic income, but it's an idea that knocks around and that, from time to time people get excited about. I think people like the idea, really like the idea. So let's talk about why don't we just do that? So I think by universal basic income, most proponents of that have in mind everyone in the country just gets sent a check or a bank transfer for some amount of money. We all get the same amount of money, and it's enough money, and this is quite important, it's enough money that it's a good platform upon which you could build a life. You could sort of live on that money. I should give the listeners a spoiler that I think we're all going to rubbish the idea, but you have a crack first, Nick. What's to love or loathe about a universal basic income?
Well, I think there are essentially two problems. One is it has to be enough to live on, right? If it's not enough to live on, it's not a universal basic income. So some people suggest quite small ones, but it's got to be something serious, kind of something like the level at which we pay the basic state pension, which we view as just about enough for a retired person to live on. The levels of taxation you would need to pay that to everybody would be absolutely astronomical. And what's also missing from that is we have, as we have discussed, have lots of other contingent benefits like children and disability. So are we going to wipe all those away and just have one benefit for everybody with no allowance for your particular circumstances? Well, I can't see that happening. So the bill's going to be even bigger because we're going to have to retain some bits of the contingency at the same time as we have a UBI. So I think it's kind of pie in the sky.
I mean, I do agree with that, but let me give what maybe kind of the best gloss for it, or a good gloss for it. So you could imagine, so this kind of connects to what Nick's saying. We give more cash to people who are in particular circumstances. Obviously on low income, we're talking about that a lot, but also in virtue of having ill health, in virtue of having kids, in virtue of having high rent, all those things contribute towards greater benefit receipt. And if you just had a pure UBI, you would be flattening all of those distinctions. So it doesn't matter whether you're a renter, it doesn't matter how many kids you got, everyone gets the same money. And so that would mean for lots of people who get a lot of cash because their needs as assessed in this way are really high, they would lose out to a very large degree. I think the best gloss you could put in it is, well, if you want to do redistribution towards people who have kids, towards people who have higher rent, towards people who have incapacity, you could use the benefit system, which is what we do. You could use the tax system. And so I think the other way of thinking about it is, well, if we made that, it require a complete rewrite of the way the tax system works, which I can see you're already appalled by.
Oh, no, not a rewrite, just not in that direction.
But in principle, that could be the means by which we do redistribution on these different margins. We have historically at certain points in time had higher tax allowances for those with kids. You could do something along those lines, for example. And perhaps one argument in favor of that is, so that kind of strategy would be like, we give the benefit in a flat way, and then we use the tax system to do the means testing. One reason for doing that, I think, which could be preferable, is you get rid of some of the problems we've been talking about with stigma. So rather than it being a problem of needing to get people to take up the benefit, it's just a problem of tax collection, which is perhaps something we've got a bit of a better idea about how to handle. So I'm not saying I'm all told convinced by my own argument, but I think that if you want to do redistribution to these different characteristics, you do have, in principle, have these two different tools available to you.
Yeah, so I agree with that, but it is worth, I think, underlying Nick's point here about just like the numbers here, right? So, most people, I think, who talk about the UBI have in mind that it is sufficient to really support. It's not just like, £5 a week. It's enough that you'd actually do something with it and you could live off it potentially. But then if you want to, I think it's a good rule of thumb, if you want to take, I don't know, average earnings and say, we're going to give everyone in the country, we'll pick some number, 30% of average earnings, you've got to raise 30% of national income to give to people. So that's, we currently raise something like 37% of national income in tax. You could look at another 30% of tax to raise money, to redistribute. And then you say, okay, that's a bit crazy. So then we'll say, well, let's just 10% of national income we'll redistribute. That's still quite a lot of money. But for each individual, it wouldn't be enough to live on. So in that sense, you're not going to be able to get around these trade-offs. That if you want to give people enough money to live on, then if you give it to everybody, that's really expensive. And if you some people, you've got to take it away somehow. And you either take it away through some kinds of means test or by only giving it to some people based on some characters in the first place. And UBI doesn't really get around that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd like to think of it as a three-way trade-off. So you're trading off between giving enough support to people on low income, total cost, and work incentives. And UBI basically just takes two of those. Depending on what the level of the UBI, you can have a high UBI, which says, actually, the work incentives look pretty good, at least before you start worrying about how we're going to have to pay for the thing. The work incentives look pretty good because
just that small issue.
Because once you get into work, you don't lose any of your benefit. And we can provide enough support for people on low income. That's one way of doing it. But obviously, it costs absolutely tons of money. Or you give a really low UBI, and then it doesn't cost tons of money. You still have the work incentive advantages, but you're not actually really supporting people who are on low income. So that three-way trade-off, I think, is like absolutely fundamental. You can't get around it. You just have to pick one. And UBI is just kind of one kind of corner of the available choices.
And we don't really know what it would do to work incentives. I mean, there have been some small experiments around the world, haven't they, with UBI, but they are very small. And I don't think the answer from them is very clear. I mean, if people have enough to live on, will this encourage them to do more work? Or will they say, well, that's all right, I can live on this, I don't want to do anything? And we really don't know what the impact would be.
We won't necessarily affect the incentive to earn a marginal pound, but the incentive over which job to take. Maybe you'll be more entrepreneurial because you've got some say-so, or maybe actually you'll think, actually, I'm going to just stay at home and not do my rubbish job. Before we just wrap up, Tom, as now the most as the person who's happiest about the idea of a UPI, at least in this room. I mean, some people will be shouting as they were, what about the administrative costs? That actually we've described an immensely complicated system. UBI, really simple. Wouldn't it just be so much better? You say, well, administrative costs, that just gives you some free money.
I think the administrative costs involved in running the benefit system are very small relative to the direct amount of cash that goes out the door. And the reason why we have these administrative costs is precisely because we think that there's good reasons to distribute more cash to people in virtue of some characteristics than others. So I think the amount of savings, I don't know the exact number. I think the amount of savings you would get from that would be absolutely trivial compared to we spend whatever it is, 120 billion on working age welfare. I don't think we'd be looking at much of a saving relative to that.
Yeah. All right, we should wrap up in a minute. I mean, lessons for the future, Nick. What do you think? I mean, you've been studying the history of this for a very long time. Do you think we should be trying to reverse this drift towards means testing? Should we just accept it and run with it? I mean, where's the system doing great and where's it going wrong, do you think?
Well, I mean, I've already said I think the bits we've got, we still retain should be retained because they do bring advantages. I genuinely think it's very difficult to try and rebuild a national insurance system. I think it's kind of one of those things when you start losing it, it's very difficult to get it back. And the reason we don't, and we don't have it because an earnings-related system is much more expensive. I mean, if you look at, this is a big, broad truism, but if you look at the rates of shares of GDP that European countries spend on public, all public services, it's normally like 2 or 3 percentage points GDP higher than it is here. And what drives that is their expenditure on earnings-related benefits and health. And those are the two things that take it up above. So if we wanted to, we're not going to go to an earnings-related one because the British people do not appear, I sound like Beveridge, don't I? But the British people do not appear to be willing to pay that sort of level of taxation to achieve it. And even if we try to rebuild it, it would be more expensive. And at the moment, for a long time now, we've not been in the world of trying to make public service, including benefits, more expensive.
Yes. What do you think? What lessons do you draw from all this time for the future of benefits and welfare?
I agree. I think it's much easier to go in one direction than the other. The logic of, well, this is a rich person, so they don't need it. There's some really poor people right now who really need more cash. That is a very strong logic, which has put us, which we've been walking down that path for decades, and it's relatively hard to see how you could reverse course. I think, insofar as we still have, insofar as we still have the sort of the more universal components, things like child benefit, sort of semi-universal, I guess, and the state pension. I do think it is worth there if governments want to think about reforming it, is to think, well, what actually is the overall goal here? If we if we simply want to take some money off rich people, the most straightforward way to do it is through the income tax system. And it probably isn't to do some, horrible means test on child benefit or for that matter, on the state pension. So I think you've got to keep in mind what the goal is and think about the overall shape of the system rather than worrying too much about this particular benefit going to this person or that person.
Great. So we should wrap up there for this episode of the IFS Zooms In. We've talked about how the UK's welfare state began with a vision of a contributory social security insurance, Beveridge's something for something system. But over time, we've moved to a means-tested system, in fact, one of the most means-tested systems in the developed world. And I think you can really see how that has happened. We had a desire to support people who hadn't contributed, to give to groups. Then you give to groups without contribution, and you have to decide which groups to give to. And you either make them contingent benefits, so you give them to people with children or who are in old age, or you give them to people on low income and then you means test it as income has arisen. And if there's one message I would take from all of our discussion today, it's that there are trade-offs. There are these 3 things we can't get around. We are trying to balance the cost of a system and not wanting it to balloon, the desire to get support to those who need it most, and incentives, and in particular work incentives. And there's no way to do all of those 3 things at once necessarily. So I suspect we'll keep a mix of both contingent and more universal benefits and means-tested benefits. And therefore we should expect to have some complexity in our system. But of course, not all complexity is good. We've had some examples today where complexity seems unnecessary. But the lesson for policymakers is they should keep thinking clearly about these trade-offs, about the cost of policies, how well targeted they are at different outcomes, and about what they do to work, savings, and other incentives. And I at least would say, for now, a big no to universal basic income on the basic. That on the notion that numbers just don't add up. To make it big enough to be really a basic income, you would have to be really reshaping the state. But most importantly, it doesn't get around the trade-offs. You still have trade-offs even with a UBI. But for now, let me say a huge thanks to my guests, Tom Waters and Nick Timmins, and thank you to you for listening. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe to the IFS Zooms In your podcast app and share it with anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for a little less £10 a month. You can just check the link in the episode description. We'll see you next time.